A woman at the clubhouse of a 55 and over community outside Sarasota, Florida, once told me, very politely, over a plate of shrimp cocktail at a mixer I'd been invited to specifically to meet people, that the pickleball group I'd been trying to join for 3 months was sort of already a closed group. But thank you for asking again. I was 76 years old at the time, 3 years into a 5-figure buy-in at that community, wearing a golf shirt I'd bought specifically because a brochure photograph had shown a man about my age wearing something similar and looking, in that photograph, completely at ease. I remember standing there holding a small plastic plate, surrounded by roughly 400 other retirees, the low hum of 100 conversations I wasn't part of washing over me, feeling more completely alone than I had in my entire life, including, strange as it sounds, more alone than I'd felt in the first raw months after Carol passed. I'm 79 now. 3 nights ago, a woman who runs the Noodle stalled 2 streets from my apartment in Chiang Mai, Thailand. A woman I've known for exactly 11 months, refused to let me pay for my dinner, calling me Pooh Blake, which roughly translates to something like Grandpa Blake, and telling me through her daughter translating that a regular doesn't pay on his birthday. I hadn't told a single soul in that neighborhood it was my birthday. She'd simply kept track, the way you'd expect a lifelong neighbor to, not a woman I'd been buying noodles from for less than a year. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe, because this is a story about something I don't think gets talked about enough in this whole retirement abroad conversation, which is that belonging isn't the same thing as being tolerated. And a lot of us spend our final decades confusing the two, mistaking a polite smile at a clubhouse mixer for the real thing simply because it's the closest thing on offer. Let me walk you through everywhere I tried before Thailand, because I think the list itself tells you something important. My wife Carol passed when I was 71, after 44 years of marriage, and the house we'd raised our kids in outside Cincinnati got too quiet too fast. Every room still arranged around a conversation that wasn't happening anymore. My first attempt at fixing that was the Florida community I just described, sold to me by a glossy brochure promising a vibrant lifestyle for active adults, photographs of silver-haired couples laughing over wine on a clubhouse patio that looked nothing like the reality once I actually lived inside it, which turned out to be a series of pre-formed friend groups going back 15 or 20 years, cliques as tight and unwelcoming as anything I remembered from high school, except now everybody involved was collecting Social Security. I tried joining the golf league, the bridge club, the men's breakfast group, showing up early, staying late, volunteering for the setup nobody else wanted to do, and got the same polite, immovable wall each time. Nothing hostile, just a very calm, very southern version of "we're full," delivered with a smile that made the rejection somehow harder to argue with than if someone had simply been rude about it. After 2 years of that, I sold the place at a loss and moved to be near my son Trevor and his family in Charlotte, thinking proximity to blood would solve what the brochure hadn't. That came with its own particular flavor of loneliness I hadn't anticipated, the kind where you're technically surrounded by family but functionally a guest in their schedule. Trevor and his wife Angela both worked full-time. My grandkids, 14 and 11 by then, had their own dense schedules already in motion by the time I arrived. Soccer practices and school projects and friend groups I was meeting for the first time as a stranger rather than a fixture, and I found myself eating dinner alone most nights in a small rental 2 miles from people who loved me and had absolutely no spare hours to prove it. Sunday dinners were the one fixed point, and I noticed myself, embarrassingly, counting down to them the way you'd count down to a holiday. 6 full days of near silence between each one. I remember sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday, having gone 4 days without a single real conversation longer than, "Hey Dad, how's it going?" Doing the math on how a man could be a 12-minute drive from his own grandchildren and still feel like he'd been shipped to the moon. I want to give you the actual numbers here, because I didn't understand the scale of this until I looked into it for this video. Roughly a third of American adults between 50 and 80 report feeling lonely, and nearly as many report genuine social isolation. Numbers that barely moved even after the worst of the pandemic passed, holding it close to the same levels researchers were seeing back in 2018, before any of us had heard the word pandemic at all. The U.S. Surgeon General formally declared it a national health epidemic back in 2023, and the research since has found chronic loneliness carries health risks comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, a comparison that landed hard for me the first time I read it, because I'd spent my whole life afraid of the one and never once considered I might be quietly doing an equivalent kind of damage to myself with the other. I am, in other words, not a special case. I was one data point in a very large, very quiet crowd of American retirees who'd done everything the culture told us to do: save carefully, move closer to family, or move to paradise, and ended up isolated anyway, 3 separate times over, in 3 separate places that had each promised me the opposite. Comment down below if you've ever felt lonelier in a crowd, or even around your own family, than you expected to at this stage of life. Because I think this particular kind of isolation, the kind that happens even when you're doing everything right, following every piece of advice a well-meaning brochure or a well-meaning son ever gave you, doesn't get talked about nearly enough. My third attempt, and I'll be honest, this one embarrasses me a little in hindsight, was 6 months in a small coastal town in Mexico, chosen almost entirely off a magazine ranking of best places to retire. A list I'd circled and studied like a horse racing form before booking a one-way flight with more optimism than research behind it. The expat scene there turned out to be heavily built around couples my own kids' age, digital nomads and early retirees in their 40s and 50s, kind enough people who'd wave and chat at the one good coffee shop in town, but building a completely different kind of life than an actual 78-year-old widower was living. Beach volleyball leagues and co-working sessions and late nights I had neither the joints nor the inclination for anymore. I found myself, again, technically present at gatherings, invited along almost out of a sense of obligation, and functionally invisible within them, too old for their volleyball on the beach, too foreign for the Mexican families 2 doors down who were warm in passing, always a wave and a smile over the fence, but had their own full, closed circles, same as Florida had. Generations of shared history I had no way to buy or earn my way into. Within 6 months. It was, of all things, a fellow widower I'd met briefly in that Mexican town, a Canadian named Gerald, who'd lost his own wife 2 years before I lost Carol, and recognized something in me before I'd said much of anything about it, who mentioned almost offhand over a beer one evening that he'd spent a winter in Chiang Mai the year before, and had never once, in 3 months there, felt like he was interrupting anybody's day just by existing near them. I filed that away the way you file away a lot of things strangers say, half curious. Mostly exhausted from 3 failed attempts already, wondering if I even had one more relocation left in me at 78 years old. One more round of packing a life into suitcases, and hoping this time the brochure would be true. What actually happened when I landed in Chiang Mai, almost immediately, in ways I genuinely wasn't prepared for, was a specific kind of attention I hadn't experienced anywhere in over 7 years of searching. Thai culture has a concept called greng jai, a word that doesn't translate cleanly into English, but roughly means a deep, almost reflexive consideration for how your presence affects the people around you. A kind of built-in social awareness that shapes nearly every interaction. And a related, deeply embedded respect for age specifically, where seniority isn't something you have to fight your way into recognition for, the way I'd fought for a spot in a pickleball rotation in Florida. It's simply assumed and extended automatically the moment people learn how old you are. I noticed it first in small, almost invisible ways. A young man on a motorbike slowing down and waiting an extra beat at a crosswalk specifically for me, in a way that felt different from ordinary traffic courtesy. A shopkeeper addressing me as Lung, meaning uncle, within our very first conversation, a term of easy, automatic respect I hadn't been offered by a stranger in years back home. A teenage boy at the market carrying my grocery bag to the Songthieu without being asked, simply because I was an old man walking slowly and he happened to be nearby. None of these were extraordinary gestures individually. What struck me was how utterly ordinary and unremarked upon they were, how nobody involved seemed to think they were doing anything worth mentioning, the way you wouldn't mention holding a door. The turning point, the one that actually convinced me this was different and not just another temporary politeness before another wall went up, came about 4 months in, at a birthday party for my landlady's granddaughter, 6 years old, which I'd only been invited to because I happened to be sitting on my balcony when the party was setting up in the courtyard below. Folding tables going up, strings of paper lanterns. A woman I only knew at that point as my landlady named Samsri, simply waving me down to join, without any of the ceremony or negotiation I'd learned to expect from an invitation back home. I assumed, honestly, standing at the bottom of my own stairs, still deciding whether to actually go over, that this was the empty, polite invitation I'd learned to expect from 3 failed attempts elsewhere, the kind you accept and then discover was never really meant for you. That I'd end up standing at the edge of the courtyard the way I'd stood at the edge of that Florida clubhouse mixer. Instead, I was seated, without any negotiation on my part, in what I later learned was one of the honored positions at the table, closest to the family elders. An older uncle of Samsri's on one side and her own elderly mother on the other, and spent the next 3 hours being included in toasts. Handed the best pieces of food before anyone else was served. Asked genuine questions about my own life by relatives of Samsri's I'd never met before that afternoon. Cousins and in-laws who'd driven in from villages an hour outside the city, none of them performing hospitality. All of them simply operating inside a framework where an old man's presence at a family gathering was an asset to the occasion, rather than an obligation to be managed. I want to be honest about something, because I don't want to romanticize this into a fairy tale the way I've seen some other channels do. I do not fully understand Thai culture, even now, after 11 months. I still make mistakes with the language, mangling tones in ways that occasionally get a polite laugh instead of the meaning I intended. Still occasionally misjudge a social cue, some subtle signal of Grengjai I've missed entirely, and only realize afterward when Wuchai gently explains what actually happened. Still feel, some days, the specific ache of being far from Trevor, and the grandkids that no amount of local warmth entirely erases. A particular loneliness that has nothing to do with how anyone here treats me, and everything to do with an ocean in a 14-hour flight. This is not a story about a place with no flaws, and I'd be doing you a disservice pretending otherwise. It's a story about the specific, narrow thing I had spent 7 years failing to find, being seen as valuable simply for having lived a long time, instead of being managed, tolerated, or politely declined. And that specific thing, it turns out, was sitting in Chiang Mai the whole time I was searching everywhere else for it. Samsri and her family have become something close to a second family to me over these 11 months. Her husband, Witch-Eye, a retired school teacher about my own age, has taken to walking with me most mornings along the moat. A slow, unhurried loop neither of us has ever once needed to justify or schedule around anybody else's convenience. The way every single social commitment back in Florida had required calendar coordination and RSVP anxiety weeks in advance. We don't talk about much on those walks: weather, his grandchildren, my grandchildren, the specific ache in his left knee some mornings and mine on others. But the walking itself, the simple assumption that of course we'll do this again tomorrow, no invitation required, no group chat to be added to or dropped from, has done something for me that 3 years of aggressively pursued pickleball never managed. Which I taught for 31 years at a primary school not far from where we walk. And he told me once, almost as an aside, that in his own culture it would be considered a small shame for him to let an old man walk alone every morning if he himself had the time and the working legs to walk alongside him instead. A sentence that has stayed with me, because I don't think I ever once heard anything resembling it spoken out loud in either Florida or Charlotte. Trevor came to visit 4 months ago, skeptical the way a son gets when his father has now tried 4 different countries and towns chasing the same elusive thing. Arriving, I could tell from the airport, half-braced to gently talk me into coming home for good this time. There's also the temple down the lane from my apartment, which I started visiting almost by accident, drawn in one morning by the sound of chanting drifting through my open window before dawn. A low, repetitive sound that reminded me, oddly, of the hymns Carol used to hum around the house, and where the monks and the regular older women who tend the grounds folded me into their small routine within a matter of weeks, without ceremony, simply handing me a broom one morning when I showed up during their cleaning hour, and assuming, correctly as it turned out, that I'd want to help rather than just watch. Nobody there has ever once asked me to convert to anything or explained the theology to me unprompted. They've simply let an old foreign man sweep leaves off a stone courtyard alongside them 3 mornings a week, treating the labor itself, not my nationality or my religion, as the entry ticket into their small community. During Songkran, the Thai New Year water festival, Samshri's whole extended family insisted I come along to the water pouring ceremony for elders, a tradition where younger relatives gently pour scented water over the hands of the oldest family members as a gesture of respect and blessing for the year ahead. And I found myself, an American widower with no blood relation to a single person in that courtyard, seated in the row of honored elders, having my hands blessed by children I'd known for less than a year, several of whom cried, genuinely, real tears, when the ceremony reached me, the way you'd expect them to cry for their own grandfather. I watched him watch Samshri's family fold me into a market trip like I'd always belonged there. Watched an elderly noodle vendor address me by name before Trevor had even introduced himself. Watched Witch-Eye wave at us from across the moat and call out something in Thai that made Samshri's mother laugh from her seat on the porch. And I could see my son visibly recalibrating something over the course of that week. Some private assumption about what his father's life had become. On the last night of his visit, he said, quietly, over dinner, setting his fork down like the sentence required his full attention, "Dad, I don't think I've ever seen you actually relax around other people. Not since Mom died. Maybe not before that either." I didn't have a ready answer for him, because I'd spent so many years assuming the problem was simply my own personality, too quiet, too old-fashioned, not suited to whatever modern retirement community life was supposed to look like, when the truth, it turned out, was simpler and harder to have known in advance, I hadn't found the wrong version of myself in Florida or Charlotte or Mexico. I'd found places that structurally had no real room for an old man to be anything other than a mild inconvenience to be scheduled around. 3 nights ago, at that noodle stall, refusing my money on my birthday, calling me Pooh Blake in that easy, unbothered way that required no effort from her at all, I sat there afterward on the little plastic stool outside her stall, eating food I hadn't paid for, watching the evening market traffic and the string lights coming on along the lane, in a country I'd landed in almost as a last resort after 3 exhausting failures, and thought about that woman at the Florida clubhouse telling me the pickleball group was sort of already closed. I don't think either place was lying to me. Exactly. I think one of them simply had room for an old man, and one of them, no matter how hard I tried, no matter how early I showed up or how many casseroles I brought to the potluck, never really did. I finished the noodles, walked the 2 streets back to my apartment slower than I used to walk anything, and slept. That night, the specific, untroubled sleep of a man who no longer has to wonder, first thing every morning, whether anybody in a 400-mile radius actually wants him around. I'm Blake. Thank you for listening to Retirement Without Borders.